Welcome to the International Schools Podcast. I'm your co-host, John Mickton. Dan, back from Bet. What happened
Definitely.
there?
Yeah, I only stayed there for a day this time. I've been there 15 years, so I kind of had enough, I think. But it was good. I went to Google Partner event. Really nice dinner at the National Portrait Gallery. We had a private room and everything. That's quite a cool experience. Yeah, good to meet a lot of people. Really, Bet's it's a trade show. It's not a conference, so it's very big. I mean, it's thousands of people. So, but great. As long as you arrange to meet people in advance, it's great. But good time. But yeah, we haven't caught up at all much this year, John. Actually, we haven't even done our New Year episode, so we need to get onto that pretty soon.
It's been, life is this busy, right?
I know, everything's
Well,
busy.
get Malt to do it for us, and then we don't have to do it.
Exactly. Cool.
Anyway, today, Dan, we have two people that have been very busy. They've launched their own podcast, which is super exciting. And the podcast is called Data Talks. And Paul Swanson, who's the Director of Innovation and Institutional Research at Atlanta International School, has been a teacher, coach, and school leader in international schools around the world. And he's really focused on helping schools use data and technology better to understand the whole child, which I think is a really interesting lens, and we'll really dig into that. With him and his co-host partner is Matthew Savage, formerly an international school principal, and with 23 years of school leadership experience in the UK and internationally. Matthew is the founding director of the Mona Lisa Effect, whose mission is to help ensure that every single student, with exception, condition, or compromise, be seen, be heard, be known, and belong. And through his speaking and writing and coaching and mentoring, he supports schools worldwide, intersecting in the fields of leadership, governance, data and assessment, and inclusion. And Matthew is a CIS affiliated consultant and member of Senya International, a board member of the International Schools in Europe and West Africa, and a member both of the Advisory Council for Parents Alliance for Inclusion and the Circle of Influence of the Global Equity Collective. And he lives no less in Skye. So to both of you, a very warm welcome to the International Schools Podcast.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
So I think the one thing that we're kind of curious and about is that when we think of data in schools, it's often small pieces of people's stories. And when all these pieces of information come together from many different places, different grades, it could be well-being data, surveys, it could be grades, attendance, observations. How do you think leaders can use this to better understand children and not just track the results? Because I think often what happens is we get result focused and we forget the child and kind of the whole child, and we're just looking at the IB scores or the attendance. So I'll let you both dive in. Maybe Paul, you want to start, and then Matthew?
Sure thing. One of the things that has come up with a lot of our guests and in conversation on the podcast, and something Matthew and I have been talking about a lot, is just that idea of aligning the data that we collect with our values as a school and our beliefs about what's important. And so, you look at these school mission statements and you're talking about lifelong learning and value the whole child and holistic education, but then the actual data that often is collected about kids often is not representative of those values. And so when you're talking about seeing the whole child in the data, I think it starts with that alignment of looking at what is it that we think is important, and are we finding measures or proxies that align with those values?
Yeah, I'd support that completely. I think if we know one thing about a child or young person, we know one thing about them. And what we actually know is that none of us are made up of just one thing, right? We're messy and we're complex and we're contradictory. So I think whenever data reduces and suggests that it's straightforward to find out the truth about a child, then it's going to miss the bulk of the picture. So I think it's incredibly important that we're always hungry for context. And when we think we've got all the context we need, we're hungry for more, because it's a journey trying to understand students in our schools. It's not some sort of destination.
I think there's also a bit of a legacy effect on some of this, right? Some of the data that we collect, we've been collecting because we've always been collecting it, and that's just how we're used to doing things. And it used to be quite difficult to collect data. We were data poor in many schools, and now we're drowning in data. And so it means that we have a lot more options available in terms of figuring out what kinds of data are important and being able to parse through qualitative data as well as quantitative data. You know, we're not just all filling out bubble sheets all the time. But then getting the culture, the data culture within a school to shift to reflect those new capabilities, I think is a lot of where schools are struggling.
We've seen almost like with the guests on the podcast, we've almost seen a bit of a trauma response come out in relation to data and assessment, right? We've heard tell of students and educators and leaders who've been kind of screwed up by how data has worked, and that legacy effect that Paul was talking
data
about.
harm.
Yeah, exactly. And
Yeah.
the need, therefore, to reclaim it and detoxify it and turn it into a force for healing almost rather than for harm. I think that was a theme that ran through all of our conversations in some way.
Interesting. Dan?
Yeah, I mean, relevant to that, I mean, schools collect a lot of data, but like, obviously it's making sense of it, analyzing it, and making useful decisions from it that is the key. And like, what, like, for schools listening to this, what have you seen? What things can they do, and what concrete things have you seen that schools do that allow them to make sense of data and make better decisions based on the data?
Do you want to take this one, Matt?
Sure. I mean, dashboards can only go so far. You know, every school's got a dashboard now. It's the thing we should have. And some dashboards are quite good. Some dashboards are pretty awful. Some dashboards really excite the data analysts in the school and terrify the user. So I think there's a need. We heard this from a lot of the guests we spoke to, for data to be not simplified, but made more instantly accessible for busy educators and leaders in schools. But in doing so, not reducing it so that it robs that complexity and that messiness that we talked about in the previous answer. And I also think what's come through a lot is that, sure, some data, maybe a lot of data, needs to be recorded. And if it's recorded, it can go into a dashboard, either in the background or the foreground. But a lot of data can't be recorded, right? Because if we're kind of redefining data as that process of getting to know someone's story, and John, you talked about the fragments of that story as well at the start, we can't be recording every single thing that we find out about a child's story. So there's got to be some balance there as well. So I don't think the dashboard is this panacea, this prize, this silver bullet necessarily.
Well, it's interesting. I'm sorry. It's interesting because schools that don't have any dashboard, that's the thing that often feels like it's holding them back. And then they get a dashboard and they're like, okay, now what do we do? And it's something else that's holding them back. And one of the things I found is that there's all of these like necessary but not sufficient pieces in order to have a strong data culture. You have to have some kind of data analytics to be able to look at in order to be able to have data conversations. But oftentimes the initial analytics that people are looking at aren't well aligned with what it is that they're actually curious about, their data questions. And so then it becomes this process of trying to find that alignment and really just articulating, like, what questions do we actually want to know about? I was having a conversation just the other day with a teacher who is going to be leading a kindergarten level data conversation with her team. And she hadn't led a conversation quite like this before, and she wasn't really sure where to start. And the beginning question she had was, like, what do you see in the data, right? And I think that those questions are important. It's sort of a exploratory, like, what are some of the patterns we notice? What are some of the things we see in this? But then at some point, you need to get more sharp in it, and you need to start saying, like, well, there's a specific grounded data question that we're looking for here. We want to know which students seem to be struggling across a number of their pre-assessment scores on this math pre-assessment. And then we can think through what sorts of support can we give them, and which skills are the whole class perhaps struggling with, or which skills have the whole class already shown mastery of. And those get a lot more pointed. But until we can even identify what data questions we really are thinking through and care about, it's very difficult to get to data-informed action.
Matthew.
And what I love about what Paul said there as well is he talks about questions then leading us to data, but that data then leading us back to questions. And I think one of the places where I see dashboards fall down, and this came out in lots of our conversations on the podcast too, was when we expect the dashboard to represent the truth, right? The answer. We're trying to work out what's going on with this student, and we look to the dashboard, and the dashboard will tell us the truth. And I think recognizing that the dashboard probably is just going to lead us to more and more and more questions is really, really important to recognize. Sure, we need a dashboard, but the dashboard in itself isn't then going to be the solution. I think that's quite powerful.
I think what you're bringing up is really important, is that sometimes, you get the dashboard or you have all these analytics and it's over information, it's overstimulation. And then you're trying to make some logic to it because you're seeing all these things and you think there has to be some answer in there. But what, Paul, you're really saying is before you even begin this journey, what do you want? What's the why? What's the purpose? What's the question you want to ask? And then you worry about the data, because if you don't have that question well aligned and there's consensus amongst the group of people that are going to take advantage of that data, I think that's so important. And I think, Matthew's, your point about the data dashboard, it's just one point of the triangulation. There might be also just anecdotal information where you look at kids' portfolios, or you ask a kid, why are you finding this so difficult? And then looking at that, does that match? And I think so often, it's almost like you're in the candy store. You've got all these fancy dashboards, and now there's artificial intelligence that does analytics, and people are like, whoa, we got all this data. And it almost feels like it's too much. And I really appreciate what both of you are saying is like, step back. What's the question? And know that the dashboard is not the panacea.
Yeah.
Do you feel that with this increase in data, and now we have artificial intelligence analytics, if you think of some of the platforms that schools have, be it a student information platform or a content management system, are you seeing a shift now that people are just like, okay, let's just put more data, or people starting to realize with experience with the dashboards that they have to recalibrate their entry point, how they begin that journey?
I think it's a mix. I mean, I think so many schools, they're just throwing stuff at the wall right now and sort of seeing what sticks with it.
Yeah.
And so, yes, you do see people just dump everything into Gemini and see what it comes up with. And then you do see people saying, well, these analytics aren't quite what we want. How do we refine it? What data do we collect? I mean, I say a huge mix in responses based on both my own experience and the people that we've spoken with. What would you say?
Yeah, I think so. I'm recovering from pneumonia at the moment, right? So I had to have investigations for my chest. So this is relevant. I'm not just oversharing. And when the medics,
you can overshare, Matthew. It's fine.
I do a lot of that as well. But when the medics were trying to figure out what's going on, they listened to my chest. So I had that way of knowing the kind of the sensing through the stethoscope and the rhythm and the beat. They also did a chest CT, so they could look at the imaging there. They had AI study the chest CT result, but they also had a human being study it. They also talked to me and listened to my story over the previous week or so. And they also got a sense just from being with me about how my health was manifesting at that time. And all of that helped them to know what was going on. So the AI was a powerful tool within that, but it didn't replace all those other things. And the AI was fallible, but also insightful, just as the human was fallible, but also insightful. And I think I mentioned that story because it demonstrates the holism that is necessary to know anyone or anything.
Yeah. It speaks to your point earlier, Matthew, though, about that data question answer cadence, where you have a question, you maybe look at a dashboard, and you come to a new question. And one of the things that I've seen is that where data practice tends to fall apart is when it takes a really long time to get the answers to any data question. So you have a question, why are these students not growing on their math score, or which students of which ethnicities are struggling and which aren't, are boys or girls struggling. And when you have siloed data and things like that, often can take weeks. You pass it over to someone and they'll come back with a custom chart, a few weeks later, and by that time the usefulness starts to go down. Where I think dashboards were a step further forwards, and AI analytics are a further step, is that they can potentially speed up that cadence, so that if you have a new question, you can try to find, you change the filters on your dashboard, or you look at a different related chart, and you don't have to create custom analytics for everything. And I think AI potentially can take that further still, where if you have a new question, you could just ask it in natural language. But I think there's all sorts of potential hazards along that route as well, everything from AI bias to poorly worded questions. But I think one that I hadn't really thought of until some of the conversations on the podcast was just how the ways that we present data to teachers influences our values and what we think is important. And so when you create a finely tuned dashboard, it's designed to answer certain kinds of questions, and there's that implicit message that these are the sorts of questions that we would want you to be asking of your students or of these data. If we ended up in a world where everybody is just chatting with an AI bot and whatever question they're coming from, there's going to be a fragmentation of what sorts of values and data related questions people ask. And so some people may be asking very, very traditional, I just want to know about term grades and standardized tests, and other people asking about just social emotional data, for example. And if the school values a holistic approach that includes all of these, we may not be furthering that aim if we just have customized analytics for each person.
But I think that's what you at the beginning were talking about, and in your bios, this word of well-being and really the student at the center. That seems for you, that's your why. You have a very clear why, what you both believe in the way that it's about belonging, it's inclusion, and it really must become before performance. So my question is, how does one support school leaders or a school culture to understand that? Because I think one of the beauties of an Excel sheet, it's a bunch of numbers, it does a calculation, it makes a graph, and you're like, good, I'm done. They're more blue than greens, and now we can go and buy the greens, or whatever it might be. I'm really kind of simplifying it. But if well-being and belonging and inclusion become so much part of that, how do you translate cold data and graphs into a culture that is focused on that?
I mean, some of it comes down to, it's like the Stephen R. Covey quote that I overuse probably, but I do think it's gold. The main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. And I think it comes down to what is a school's main thing. And this ties in with what Paul said about the school's guiding statements, its values, etc. You look at most schools' guiding statements and their websites, and when you hear them talk about themselves, they're all about the flourishing, right? They're all about the holism. They're all about, we've got happy kids. They're all about those very human things. But as Paul suggested earlier, their measurement is not. So when we're talking about data and well-being, we're just saying there needs to be an alignment between our ontology as a school, what are the ways of being that really fuel and fire us, and our epistemology as a school. What and how are we going to measure? So it just makes sense, really. And if we were in a school that was an exam factory, right, and it was honest about that, and it said, our school, we're about getting the highest possible academic attainment, whatever the cost, then they don't need to try and know and understand well-being, because it doesn't matter. But what I think is exercising me, and Paul, I think as well, is the number of schools that say we're all about the flourishing and the whole child, but when you look at their data, it's all about the academics. And I think that tension just needs to be explored with more honesty, I think, maybe.
But isn't that because the fact is you can be all holistic and inclusive and well-being focused, but at the end of the day, a parent that's paying tens of thousands of whatever currency, and they're going through a private school, they want their kids to get good grades to get to a good university. So when a school, if you look in the summer, schools are not putting out graphs of the level of well-being in their school. They're putting out graphs of how well the kids did in the IB compared to everybody else.
Yeah.
So there is this kind of tension between the two, but I think when push comes to shove, schools say we better put those graphs out with the IB results, and the well-being is something we'll keep inside, we'll put on our mission. And actually that at the end of the day is important, but really for us to keep bumps on seats and happy parents, we need to make sure we get good grades.
Yeah,
I mean,
but I think
the
there's a lot, John, don't we? Because
what's that?
I think there's red herrings there, though, John, to be honest with you. I think that is the thinking behind lots of schools and lots of school leaders. But I wondered sometimes, why is it that parents can seem to be interested in the academic grades above all else? Could it be because that's what the schools are talking about? The fact that the schools are foregrounding all of the academic results in their social media collateral of an August, could that be shaping what the parent expectations are? I don't think that parents in and of themselves intrinsically want their kids to have high grades. Parents want their kids to be independent. They want them to be agile and adaptive. They want them to be happy and healthy. They want them to have a fulfilling and successful and flourishing life. That's what they want. They don't want the grades per se. And I think there's too much of that conversation just treading those old roads that.
But John, I mean, we talked about this before, haven't we? In terms of, obviously, we're talking international schools. What international schools say and what they do are often some very different things. And you can see around IB results time, which is LinkedIn is just all it is. This was our average score. This X number of students got this, and it is. I mean, and Paul, you've worked in Asia, and there's cultural differences in different countries and different, and obviously grades are at the top of parents' minds. I think not just in Asia, but I mean it can be extreme in some countries. But I mean, John, what do you think the solution is? Do you think that, I'm just curious of your opinion about this in terms of.
I think part of the reason is parents are measuring their own success, which very likely was more exam driven than well-being. That's their point of reference. If I think of my own schooling in the Swiss school system, it was all about grades. I mean, it was like 4.25, 6, 7, 9, 5, or whatever it was. And the report card was a bunch of numbers, either in red or black. Okay, the teachers were super kind, but that was not the message. And I assume my parents, and I think they came from a culture that was the same. So I think that's part of it. As to a solution, I think it's what Matthew and Paul are saying, is that we need to create venues to support an understanding that this well-being and the whole child and inclusion really should be in the front of center, but that very likely requires, professional development and people like Paul and
Yeah, I
Matthew
agree.
that are working with schools and trying to shift the thinking. I don't know, Paul, is that kind of what you guys are
No,
doing?
just something super quick, John, as well, because I agree, and I agree with what Matthew said as well. I mean, I can speak it from the parents' side, 'cause I'm an international. I've got two kids at international school, and I'm paying a ridiculous fee, so I can see what I want. And I'm like Matthew. I genuinely don't. I couldn't care less about grades. It's absolutely the bottom of my priority. I think my kids I want them to be happy and curious, and I don't think. Who knows if they'll even be going to university when they finish? I think it's becoming less and less relevant. But I think anecdotally, like the vast majority of parents do hugely care about grades at my kids' school. I think it's the main thing, and not the other metrics are really important. But I think when you're looking at, say, the 10 international schools in Prague, it's a distinguishing factor. And in my opinion, it's too important. But I think the schools, do play into that as well. So
I think that, John, your point that parents are basing a lot of these values based on their own experience, that resonates for me. I feel the same way. And I think that parents are inherently very conservative when it comes to their kids' education, because the idea of trying something new on my child does not sit well with a lot of parents. But you frame it as like innovation or, making it relevant for changing world, things like that. People are a little bit more open to it. I come back to when I was in Singapore, I was in a leadership conversation, and we were talking about what we thought of as important for the kids. And it was safe, happy learning, in that order. And you're right. Like most schools, what they share about is the learning part. They don't really share much data about the safe and the happy part. But, if I were thinking about what school to send my parent to, and I knew that there was a school that was rife with bullying, for example, or kids were feeling unsafe, I would not want to send my kids. I would pull my kids immediately from that school. So to say that parents only care about that, I think it's almost like a Maslow hierarchy of needs. Like once you have the safety, then all you're thinking about is like, are they happy there? And once they're happy there, then you're thinking about the grades, because you're taking the others for granted. But if you stop being able to take those for granted, you pull your kid out of there. And I think that is happening more and more. I have a colleague whose child was coming to school unhappy every day. And she's like, no, we're moving. This is not what we want to do. And I think that that's more common now than it was when I was a kid, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Matthew.
Yeah, and I think it also drives enrollment more. I think this idea that parents choose a school based on the grades, I don't think plays out, because every school says they get the best grades. Every school says they're about excellence, right? I think what drives enrollment is whether the kid comes home and says, I like being at my school. Yeah. The point I wanted to add, though, was about permission and fear. I think that we're all scared. I think parents are scared. What if my child doesn't get what they need to live a happy and successful life? And I think they're scared about doing a good enough job as a parent. I think school leaders are scared if we do things differently, then will we lose out? Will we start losing our kids to other schools, or will we lose our parents, etc.? So I think leaders are scared. There's an awful lot of fear out there. And I think lots of it comes down to permission. There isn't an either or here. There isn't. In fact, the bulk of research, recent research as well, says pretty loudly what we knew anyway, right? The greater my sense of well-being and belonging and feeling like I'm included, the better my grades are going to be anyway. So it's not saying, let's throw out the academic grades and let's just focus on the well-being. We know that the well-being feeds the academics. We also know that putting the academics first actually drives well-being down. And we know that we're in the midst of a child and adolescent mental health crisis, with self-harm and suicide rising exponentially, right? So I think it's about permission and fear. We're scared to do things differently. We're scared to talk in different ways about what schooling is about. So we need permission to do so. And as a school, if I can make sure I have permission as a leader to talk a different story, then I won't be scared of talking a different story. If I, as a parent, am given permission to ask different questions of the school, then I won't be scared of asking different questions of the school. So I think there are ways forward here.
Yeah, and I think the way you describe that kind of, well-being helps with grades, and there's that close relationship. I'm wondering, because both of you actually, you do a podcast, you both are professionals, but you also work with schools and you often run data in school conferences. When you go to a school and you walk in and you've had the conversation with the leadership team or whoever is the data point person, what is usually the thing that surprises you most when you walk into a school and you're like, what are some of the things, what are some of the patterns that you're noticing? And this is not about blame or anything, but just more an observation. What are some of the patterns you're noticing, how schools are approaching this that maybe haven't yet engaged with this idea of the well-being inclusion? Not that they don't want to, but they might have just not thought about it or don't know how to do it. I'm just curious from both of your experiences working with many schools around the world.
I would say that most schools that I have talked to, they're just trying to wrap their head around the data that they're already dealing with. They're trying to figure out, how do we de-silo these things? How do we make use of it? How do we set it up? Until that starts to happen, it's very difficult for schools to even contemplate, how do we add additional sources of data that might better reflect our values, because they're feeling underwater with what they already have in many cases. But you asked about like what surprises me. I think one of the things that surprises me is that the variability of how schools do things always surprises me. I think I've seen a lot of different ways of doing something, but inevitably when I go to a new school or talk to people, they're doing it in a different way. There's very little like standardized practice about this is how you do it and this is what works. Everybody is trying to figure it out sort of on their own, and I think that that's what things like the Data in Schools conference and our podcast and other things are trying to do, is learn from each other so that we're not all creating the same mistakes over and over. What would you say, Matthew?
Yeah, I'd say themes, right? The inherited paradigm that we've been referring to and that you've referred to, John, how you were schooled, how your parents were schooled, it's broken. It doesn't work. Maybe it never did, but it certainly doesn't work in today's world with the challenges that children and young people have, right? So what I see from the schools with whom I work is instantly a recognition, this doesn't work. We want to do things differently, but we don't know how. And there's a tremendous appetite and hunger to do things differently, but to be given permission to do so, to be supported and partnered in doing so. But I must stress, that's the schools who choose to work with me. And the schools who choose to work with me tend to be the ones who want to take that first step, but are a bit scared about doing so. There are an awful lot of schools that I've never worked with, obviously, because there's 15,000 international schools in the world. And I can't speak for all of those. But I do think there's a growing sense that data as was isn't enough. And we've got to do better and we've got to be better. But for me, I see it as a return, right? Ancient wisdom, indigenous wisdom knew that we know stuff through our intuit, through our gut, through our sensing it, through those softer, more mysterious ways, as well as through our head. And then over the last 2,000 years, Plato, Aristotle, rationalists, the empiricists, they all told us, no, head knowledge, that's the thing, that's where it's at. And where we seem to be now in schools is at the end of a long period where we've kind of accepted that unless I can know stuff about my kids here, and I can measure it here and therefore put it down onto a chart or onto a dashboard or onto a report, then I don't know it. We're now moving into a space where we're realizing, well, it hasn't always been like that, so it doesn't always have to be like that. So I'm cautiously optimistic, I think I would say.
Nice. So, most school leaders very likely have not taken a course in data analytics or data. Many of them, because schools are quite transient, people go from one and they have one type of tool and then they go to another. Okay, there's some standardizations like, some of the Google products and some Microsoft products. But I'm just wondering, you know, is that a part of leadership and being an educator, is being able to understand data and understand data skills, data literacy? How important is that nowadays? Because I assume, I'm just thinking of my own experience in different schools. We had a lot of data and data analytics, but yeah, we got a little PD with the vendor or some consultant, but wasn't like that was part of our professional journey generally. So I'm just curious, is what is data literacy today, and how is it important for school leaders and teachers as we have these very powerful dashboards? And Paul, you mentioned now the use of artificial intelligence.
Well, I have a somewhat maybe controversial position on this question on data literacy. Most people, when they think of data literacy, they think of statistics, learning how to read a pie chart or a bar chart, or learning not to use a pie chart, something like that, or maybe some graphic design skills on how to make a good visualization. To me, those are technical skills that are fairly easy, and you could go to any number of websites and pick them up probably within a day or two. I think that the hard part in my mind of data literacy is the emotional intelligence needed to lead that work appropriately. Because data at its heart challenges our assumptions and our reality and our understanding of what things are. If I've been teaching for 10 or 15 years and the data doesn't show that kids are growing on something as much as I would like them to be, or doesn't show that they're feeling safe in class because of something that I'm doing, the most natural reaction is to try to justify why it is that we're seeing data that hurts, that makes us feel uncomfortable. And so if you are a leader trying to navigate in that space where people are feeling very out of their comfort zone and feeling exposed, that's really hard. There was a story in, I think, episode 2 of our podcast. Salim Blevins was sharing this about how he was a principal in a school, and they were looking at this grade 4 reading data, and they had big standardized tests in grade 4, and he wanted to show the data and really get some momentum around looking at it and saying, how do we address this as a school? And he did that on the first day of school. And 6 months later, a teacher came to him and said, "I can't believe you shared my data in front of everyone like that, and humiliated me." And that was a real learning experience for him about, that emotional intelligence dimension of how do we help people feel safe and cared for, but also challenged and moved a little bit out of their comfort zone when there's a disconnect between their perception of reality and other perceptions of reality as shown through data. What would you say, Matthew?
Well, just remind me, Paul, what's your subject specialism, your major when you were at university? What's your subject?
So I studied ethnomusicology when I was in college, but then I became a social studies teacher.
There you go. So ethnomusicology and social studies. And I'm an English teacher, right? And we're both here talking about data. I've been a head of school, a director of a whole school, where I'm supposed to know something about everything, right? But I don't need to be an expert in all of those things. I don't need to be an expert in data analytics any more than I need to be an expert in human resources. For me, the issue isn't data literacy. For me, the issue is epistemological literacy. Yes, emotional intelligence, emotional awareness, and sure as hell, many of us don't have enough of that. But for me, it needs to be literacy in knowing. And there's a massive irony in that a lot of the schools that we're talking about are IB schools who are required to teach TOK, the theory of knowledge. They're required to teach kids about knowing and the plurality of knowing. And when it comes to knowing their kids, they don't follow any of that at all. So I'd talk about epistemological literacy, and there needs to be an awful lot more of that. Yes, we need data analysts on our team. I've never been a data analyst, but I love data because for me, data isn't just stats and charts. Data is knowing, and it's relationality, and therefore it's getting to know other human beings.
Dan, I'm curious because you work with a lot of schools and you provide data, you talk to schools. What are your thoughts on that idea of a data literacy? Because you provide cybersecurity services and a lot of things that you do for schools that obviously is based on data.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I would say is like I've seen the change over like I'd say 3 years. It's exponentially increasing. Schools are. I mean, I think I'd say I'm just guessing numbers, but I'd say 3 years ago schools weren't even aware of any concept of data. Well, they were aware of it, but there wasn't. Maybe it was a technical thing. There wasn't tools, things like Data Studio and Looker Studio and all these other tools that can bring it together. But I think what's interesting is just the like every school is looking at it. Bigger schools have got a data person, sometimes even more than one person, and I think the speed at which it's growing is just like really rapid, and AI it's even driving it more. So that's my only point of that. I think it's a and I'm curious how it's going to go. Are schools going to move from, like you were talking about here, move from just analyzing the data to really actioning it? So yeah, I don't know. It's been a huge increase for sure.
What I think is what I appreciate, as Dan shares this growth and how more schools actually have a data person, et cetera. But both of you are really saying that it's about how do we engage a community where we are careful and thoughtful and mindful of when some facts come out of the core data, which is just numbers or percentages or graphs showing improvement or not improvement. How do you translate that in a way that people don't feel threatened, and that you can actually take that and build on that and enhance the experience or enhance the approaches? And I think so often we forget how important that is. And I thought your anecdote of the principal 6 months later, the teacher was like, I'm just wondering, they waited 6 months. They must have been humiliated for a long time. That's, but that they suddenly came up and said, listen, this was not okay. So I really think it's important how you're highlighting this is as a leader, because there's pressure, you go to board meetings and you have to show IB scores or improvements or reading scores. And, in these meetings, there's not much time for deep philosophical conversations, and it tends to be a lot of charts and quick running through things. But I'm wondering, what do you think are some of the things leaders can do if they feel they want to engage with that approach? So more emotional intelligence, knowing about the knowing. What are some things that when you work with teachers and educators, you coach them, or some of the tools that you have them explore so they're more aligned maybe with your approaches that you both shared just now?
There's one word I'd challenge there that you used, John, and I don't mean any discourtesy.
No, this is why we're on a podcast. This is good.
You talked about sometimes the facts come out of the data, and I disagree. I think that I wrote recently a piece about the definite article, and used the word "the" before certain things, and the data is something that we use an awful lot or find ourselves using. But there isn't such a thing as the data. There are so many flags that the data plants. There are so many questions the data asks us, but the data isn't going to give us facts, because that suggests that there's a single story about any individual student. What I found really interesting about your question there was it alludes to the governance piece. Now, if we accept that it's an inevitability that governing bodies will always want to see hard, tidy graphs and charts about their kids, then we also accept that much of what we're talking about here is never going to change. Now, I speak as a head of school who, like lots of head of schools, had to manage my board to some extent. And now I speak as someone who's on 2 boards. Governance needs education. Governance needs to change. Governance needs to start asking different questions in different ways, such that leaders feel they then have the permission to do so. Otherwise, the more trepidatious leader will sing to the tune that the governor's set, and the bolder leader will do the right thing, the bold, the courageous thing that we've talked about, and play the game on the side that will keep the board happy. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to go into governance and their understanding of data and the data as well.
Thank you. That's really an interesting observation, and I think it's good that you bring that up, because governance is at the end. That's what most school leaders are answerable to, is the board of directors or board of trustees. Yeah. And thanks for calling me on the fact. I think I'm just and I didn't express myself, but your point's a very important one, was that people see data and then they say, oh, that must be it. They just make an assumption. It's a bit like misinformation, it's just like, oh, we see that, so that must be real, and we're not digging behind, or as you said so well, having all the different components that have to be part of that know about a student or a piece of information. So, Paul.
But just continuing on that track of thinking a little bit, when we talk about, what does data actually mean? What does it show? If a student gets a score on assessment or answers a survey in a particular way, or even if they fill out demographic information, that data, there's an implied transferability of it, an abstraction layer, right? If someone gets a certain score on an assessment, we abstract to it about their internal knowledge and understanding and skills about different things. And that's what we care about. We don't really care about how they filled out certain questions on a particular piece of paper. What we care about is whether or not that has a connection with something else that is sort of inherently unmeasurable directly, but we find these proxies. And so I think, these are the epistemological questions that Matthew was talking about. But your original question, John, was about, how can leaders learn more and how can they deepen their practice with these things?
It was more about with the, because you've been really focusing on the idea of well-being, emotional intelligence, and Matthew was talking about knowing, kind of the allusion to the TOK. I'm just wondering, when you're talking to leaders, and of course, when you both are talking to leaders, you're sharing your philosophy and approach. That's why they hired you or have you as a consultant. What are some strategies that you're, coaching them in or mentoring them in, where they can make that shift, maybe just in their own thinking before doing any action?
Yeah, I think that some of the protocols and mental models that I've been using with school leaders are things that I've built along the way after doing too many presentations and things on data. And then some of them are resources that I point people to. But I think that, again, part of the need for our podcast, part of our why in creating this podcast, is to have more of a discourse and conversation for people to hear different points of view on these issues. And if they don't agree with everything, great. What sort of disagreement does that provoke? And let's have these conversations and join in that community. Because Matthew, I think sometimes, I don't know if you even remember this, but a couple of years ago, you had this great quote. There are 15,000 international schools around the world, and 14,900 of them know that there should be doing something with data, but they're not quite sure what to do. And I don't think that's changed too much over the last couple of years. I think that maybe the number of international schools has grown, but the proportion that really feel like they have a good grasp of data is probably about the same. And I think part of that is because the technology is changing so rapidly that what is possible today was not possible a year ago, or even maybe a week or two ago, talking about some of the advances of AI and things like that. And so some of the capabilities that educators have, educational leaders have, they know about these things because they've heard about it somewhere on like some sort of chat or a message board, or principals training college, PTC, whatever. But in terms of even asking, knowing what questions to ask, I think we're still in the beginning phases of that. I think most education leaders are still grappling with trying to know what questions to ask. And so at that point, it becomes a question of how do you build capacity to ask the right questions and start developing a data strategy and moving forward. And you either bring the right people into your organization who have that capacity, or you partner with people from outside the organization who can support in that capacity.
And I think just what I would often say to school leaders, and I've been having conversations even today with school leaders with whom I'm partnering, is we need to slow down. Now, there's something of a guru of mine, Nora Bateson, who does her own work in something that she calls warm data, which is a totally different but fascinating rabbit hole that people might want to explore. But she once said, we don't have time to be in a hurry. And I think the best advice I can give to school leaders when I work with them is that when working with data, sometimes we need to slow down to be more efficient. Because if we slow down and we let all of that plurality of data, multiplicity of data kind of seep into the soil, and then we get to figure out and understand and sense what's going on, then we can take decisions which can be really wise and really effective and can reduce workload and stress and anxiety and pressure later on. So I would say we need to slow down because we don't have time to do anything but.
It's interesting you bring that up, because I think sometimes one of the selling points that you hear of data and data analytics and the dashboards and, leveraging artificial intelligence is that you can become much more agile. You can have instant information. And there's a sense of like the hurry, before it took too long, and now you can have it instantly. You click on your screen and bingo, all the different graphs come up and they're interactive. So I really like what you're saying, is that actually it might feel counterintuitive, but what you're saying, that's actually the best way to engage with data, is really giving it time. It's a bit like a good wine, just letting it age a bit.
But I think that's one of the cons of late stage capitalism, without meaning to get too political, right? Is that AI can help us become more productive. I don't think we need to be more productive. I think sometimes we need to be less productive. But you can see why we rush towards a quick answer, because I look out the world today, and my word, it doesn't make sense. So I want it to make sense. And if something waves up its hand and says, I'm a quick and easy answer, you can see why I'm drawn to that, because, it'll make sense, and I'm desperate for that. But I think we, in our roles, need to be coaching and mentoring and partnering with leaders to encourage them and to give them permission to slow down, because I think that's the way to, just things being better.
Yeah.
Can I add to that?
Of course.
So I agree and I disagree a little bit. I agree with the idea of needing to slow down, but why are we slowing down? I think that we need to slow down so that our cognitive effort is focused on the right things rather than the wrong things. Because I think in the past, we were moving slowly because we were spending all of our mental effort trying to figure out what the unique ID of a student is, that we can connect it with this other thing, and just doing this drudgery type of work. And now that can be much faster. That can be automated. And, like these dashboards can triangulate things, and we can get to a certain point. And I think that that's what I call being data smart, is that being efficient, being effective, getting clear results based on what we have. And then when we get to that certain point, that's where, this isn't data driven, this is data informed. And that's where we have to pause. And that's where that wisdom piece, I think we have to be smart. We have to have smart systems, but we need to know their limits. and then we need to be wise in how we use the results. And I think it's the same way with other types of AI. Like if I have a question from my professor or a question from whatever, and I just ask Gemini and I just go with it, and there's no thinking on my part involved, that actually hasn't served me very well. But if I get some fast answers and then use that as a thought partner and start coming up with other perspectives and workshop that with my spouse and whatever, then it becomes a very different sort of story. But I think that that purposefulness of attention is one of the greatest challenges of our time right now, because our attention is being yanked around from thing to thing to thing. And so to be really deliberate in terms of where we are putting that attention and where we are taking the time to really reflect deeply on something, I think that that's a tremendously important skill.
I don't think it's a disagreement either, Paul. I think we're in alignment. You know, mostly you probably find this yourself as well, John. Most leaders we speak to are exhausted because they're spending so much time firefighting and mole whacking and problem solving.
Constantly. And then, you know, then they have to produce a board report or an annual report. And they go to their dashboard and they don't understand it. And then it's not what I want. And, you know, it just goes on. But I like, Paul, what you said. You kind of broke it into two very concrete pieces for me, and hopefully our listeners too, is this idea of being data informed and then data wise. You know, this wisdom piece. Or am I misquoting you?
Well, I think of, I went to I think it was at the IRCOS conference a few years ago, and they had this great distinction that the first time I saw it about being data driven, data informed, and data inspired.
Okay. Oh, I like that. That's even better. Boy, we're gonna have to put that as our logo here.
And so here's how I describe it. Data driven is if this, then that. It's if I hit 3 absences, an alert goes out. I can program the rule into the machine and it just goes. And there are some tasks that are data driven or can be data driven like that. Data informed, you get to a certain point of the data, but then there's the context, there's the story, there's the human judgment. And I may have a range of options that I might go with, but it requires that human wisdom of knowing how to go to the next step. And then data inspired, I think of as I have this intuition that this is useful. I have no idea how I might use this in the future, but I have a sense that this will be helpful at some point in time. And so I'm going to take a note of it. Maybe it's, you know, one of the conversations of our podcast was about like what type of potato chips a child might like. Like, I don't have a data-informed set of responses for how to act on potato chip knowledge, but there may be an opportunity at some point to make a connection with the child, and so that becomes a source of inspiration.
And that's a great way to break that down. I really appreciate you doing that so clearly. We're coming to the end of the podcast, but I want to make sure that our listeners understand a couple things. So, Data Talks podcast, you can find it on, and I'm going to make an assumption, and correct me if I'm wrong, on your Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all the ones that you love. And also you can follow both Matthew and Paul on LinkedIn. And Matthew also has the Mona Lisa effect, and there's a website, and you can get that on our show notes. So as our audience knows, the show notes is always a good place just to go, grab those things, and then I'm sure Paul and Matthew would be only happy to have further conversations with you on this topic. Both of you, thank you so much. So fascinating. And I for me, what I really resonates and what I applaud is this idea of making the child well-being, belonging, inclusion, and being in the center. I think that's a great frame to work with, and I think that is not something in my past when talking about data that has been in the forefront. And I think both of you have done a really wonderful job of making sure that we understand how important that is as you start carving out the questions and thinking about the knowing and, you know, what are the repercussions? How do you juggle this emotionally as a leader and being mindful and empathetic? So both of you, thank you so much for being on the International Schools podcast. And to our listeners, thank you again for your comments and feedback on LinkedIn. We really appreciate that you're going into that space, because that's kind of where we find it easier to respond. And many of you have come with ideas, and even some organizations and individuals have said, hey, I would like to be on your podcast. So if we say not right now, it's not out of disrespect. It's just that we have quite a few guests, and we try to head it. And I'm sure Matthew and Paul understand that we try to schedule things, because Dan and I, and like Matthew and Paul, we all have day jobs, so we have to juggle both. Anyway, we're most grateful for your continued listenership and support, and really do go and listen to Data Talks. I got to listen to a couple, and they're excellent. They're really interesting, and Matthew and Paul bring so much wisdom and expertise that I think all of us can really benefit from. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, John.